Yes, I'm from the Center for Public Interest Communications at the University of Florida, and we spend a lot of time reading across academic disciplines to understand how the human mind works and how human behavior works, so we can build strategies, communication strategies to drive social change. And one of the things that we find over and over and over again in the research is that storytelling is the most powerful tool we have for driving social change. We've heard that today so far in the panel, and what science tells us is that stories capture our attention. We're more likely to remember information if it's wrapped in a story, and if a story is really good, it can lower our inclination to counter-argue on issues we disagree with. And if we think about all of the movements that have led to institutional change and cultural change, people took to the streets and took action because they connected to a story that catalyzed a movement. What's interesting for us, though, is that, as cognitive psychologist Jerome Bruner says, we know storytelling is effective, but scientifically, we don't really know what makes a great story. What makes a story more compelling and more persuasive than another story? So with some funding from the Knight Foundation, my colleagues Ann Cristiano and Matt Sheen and I brought together a bunch of scientists who studied storytelling from different disciplines, from neuroscience to social psychology and sociology, even a guy who studies how to make horror films scarier. Everybody was there, and we spent a year diving into this science. And what we found was that there were a set of principles that we can use to build compelling and persuasive stories. So I want to quickly share some of these principles with you. They're all available online at scienceofstories.org, but I'm going to very quickly go through a couple of them that I think are really important as we think about how we leverage stories for movement work. So the first one, this isn't going to be too much of a surprise for you, but stories have structure. A message is not a story. A vignette is not a story. A story has a beginning, middle, and end. Stories have conflict and resolution. Stories have characters and settings. Stories have a challenge and the overcoming of those challenges. If you are not sharing these pieces in your stories, you are not telling a story. And that means that you're not going to gain all of those cognitive benefits that I described in your communication. So if we really want to use storytelling, we have to follow the narrative arc. Now, we also know that there are plot structures. Researchers have studied thousands and thousands of stories and found that there are generally 7 basic plot structures that we use to tell stories. We have overcoming the monster, rags to riches, or riches to rags, the quest, voyage and return, comedy, tragedy, and of course, rebirth. And what's really, really exciting for us is that we're finding in the research that depending on who you're trying to persuade, you would want to use a different plot structure. So for instance, let's say you're trying to talk to people who are new to your issue or who have never thought about it before. You might want to use a familiar plot structure that can help orient them to how they should feel about the issue. If I wrap my issue in the Cinderella story, I can quickly assess who's the evil stepmother, who's the Cinderella, whose side should I be on, and how will this likely end. That builds my understanding of the issue, right? However, if you're trying to re-engage your choir, get people who have heard your stories over and over again to pay attention, you might play with a different plot structure, something they had not heard before. So we want to be intentional with the plot structures that we use, depending on the audience that we are engaging with. The next piece that we found really exciting is the science of emotion. Often when we try to tell emotion-driven stories, we do something like this, right? How many of you get up and get a sandwich when this commercial comes on? Don't you love animals? Of course you do, but science tells us people don't like to feel bad. Yet we often lead with these negative emotions. And that's troubling because what we've seen in the research is that there's a full range of emotions that we could be playing with. Researchers have identified 27 different emotions, and each of these emotions does a different thing. So depending on what you're trying to accomplish, you should use a different emotion or a couple of different emotions to create an emotional experience. Sadness makes us want to reach out and help somebody. If we don't have a way to resolve sadness, we'll disengage. Fear makes us want to fight or run away, and if we don't have a way to fight, we'll run away. Anger reduces our ability to take the perspective of others, but it is really powerful in organizing us around a common enemy. So depending on what your objective is, you might want to use anger, and you might not want to use anger. There are also a lot of positive emotions that we are ignoring. Awe, which is really exciting for us, is an emotion that opens us up to new perspectives. We're more likely to listen to people we may disagree with if we can lead with an emotional experience of awe. Pride is also a really exciting emotion we're looking at in the research, where people are more likely to act out of anticipated pride than guilt. And this is primarily true when we think about actions around climate change activism. And parental love is one of the strongest emotional drivers we've seen. We have an evolutionary imperative to want to protect our young ones, right? And the Say Yes campaign in Ireland did this exceptionally well. They were able to pass the marriage referendum by telling stories of parents that would, of course, vote yes for same-sex marriage because they would want their child to have equal rights under the law just like any other child. That worked for them in Ireland. So we want to be really thoughtful and intentional with the emotions that we use, so that way we can be strategic in how we mobilize people to action. The next thing that we're excited about is this idea of creating space for your audience. You've probably heard this before. We want to bring people into the story. We want to create space for them. And for us, we think about it in this way: empty spaces and full spaces. And I'm going to give you some context to what we mean by that. Empty spaces. So when you're telling a story, you never want to lead with the ending, right? You don't want to know how it ends right when you start. You want to give your audience 2 + 2. We want to sit on the edge of our seat or turn the page and find out what's next. Don't lead with 4, lead with 2 + 2. Andrew Stanton at Pixar says, "It's the well-organized absence of information that draws us in." The other piece that we need to think about when we're thinking about empty spaces is how we create room for the audience to insert their own experience into the story. The poet Mary Oliver does this really well. She writes poetry where we can insert our own experiences and the challenges that we're experiencing into the narrative that she's creating. And we could see that with this short poem, Don't Worry. Things take the time they take, don't worry. How many roads did St. Augustine follow before he became St. Augustine? All of us have an experience that we're inserting into this poem, right? There's space for all of us in here. And we saw the power of this when the story of Elon Kurdi went viral. We hypothesized that this story was so impactful because we don't see his face and he's dressed as any child would be dressed, and we imagine someone we love, a child we love, in his place. And what we saw is that after that story went viral, interest in the Syrian civil war spiked, and also donations to the refugee crisis spiked as well. So full space is a really interesting concept for us to think about. When we're trying to overwrite assumptions or overwrite biases or misinformation, we want to be really thoughtful with how we fill our stories with lots of rich detail. We don't want to lead with data, obviously, and we don't want to lead with abstract concepts and terms like justice, racism, social determinants of health, because when we do that, we leave a lot of space for audiences to insert what they think we mean. And if they disagree with us, science tells us they're more likely to fill in with extreme assumptions. So we want to use lots of rich, figurative language to describe what these abstract concepts look like. Martin Luther King was the master of this. We can look at his I Have a Dream speech and see how he paints picture after picture of what freedom and justice looks like. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Right? Picture after picture of what that would feel like. That's how you create full spaces and overcome misinformation or biases. So what would this look like for you as you're telling stories? Let's say you were wanting to play with the concept of school. If you wanted to create an empty space, you might just say school, and all of us would insert our assumption of what school is. We would think of the schools we attended, what they smell like, what they look like, and we'd bring that picture to our mind, and we've created space in the story for us to insert our experience. Let's say you wanted to rewrite our assumptions about school. Maybe we have biases or preconceived notions of what school is. You would use lots of figurative language to overwrite the narrative I have in my mind with a new one. Okay, so one of the things that we heard over and over again in our conversations with scientists and when we look at the research is that stories must have verisimilitude. And that means they have to feel true and look true, or they need to be authentic. So as we got deep into this, we came across this statistic from Pew on factors that people report determine what they feel is what makes a news story trustworthy. What stood out to us was this data point, that their gut instinct determined what they thought was more true. So that's really interesting for us as storytellers to know. We need to figure out what leads somebody to feel like something is more true rather than just know empirically or objectively that it's true. And what we're finding is that who delivers the story determines how true it feels. The people who are most affected by the issue are more likely to tell stories that feel more true. There was a study done by Karen Ball-Jorgensen at Cardiff University, and she had two groups of participants learn about a flood, one from a news anchor and another from a woman who was filming herself in the flood. And the participants who learned about the flood from the woman were more likely to say that that story was true, despite the fact that they both were true, and that's because they heard it directly from her. This is really interesting for us to think about as we think about racism in the criminal justice system. For a long time, activists have been organizing on this issue. And for decades, we've had evidence from academia that Black and brown people are over-policed and that the criminal justice system is racist. And in fact, I found this paper from 1928 that said that, right? So since the 1920s, we have had evidence that this is true. But it wasn't until we heard story after story after story from the people who experience police brutality, whose loved ones experienced police brutality, that as a society, we took action, we took to the streets, particularly those who don't experience this violence every single day. So that tells us that the most affected are the most effective. And I'm going to move ahead to my last point, that storytelling is truly the most powerful tool that we have, but with great power comes great responsibility, and that requires us to be extremely intentional and thoughtful with how we build our stories. And we can use insights from behavioral and cognitive and social science to do so with intention. Thank you.